Welcome to our second video lecture in our Unit 2 portion on memory. In today's video lecture, we are going to look at the different types of encoding, the strategies that we can use to better harness our ability to encode information, and some of those short-term and long-term impacts of better encoding or worse encoding. So to begin with, there are two overarching types of encoding. There's automatic and effortful encoding. Automatic encoding is exactly like it sounds. It happens automatically. It's information that goes through our sensory memory into our working or short-term memory, depending on what memory model you're looking at, and automatically goes to our long-term memory. We don't have to do any work to get it in there. We automatically encode things, three different types of things: for space, time, and frequency. So when we're talking about space, we're talking about kind of where things are located in your world. So if you imagine right now your English class and imagine where you sit in your English class, you could you visually memorize where you sit in comparison to where the teacher desk is in there. Or if you think about your math class, where is the teacher desk in your math class? You have automatically encoded that. You didn't spend work trying to remember where that teacher desk is. That's something that just automatically went into your long-term memory. We also automatically encode information for time. So kind of like a sequence of events. So if you think through what are the sequence of events or activities that you did this weekend, or what did you do yesterday, we automatically, again, encode what are kind of those activities we did and in what order do we do those activities. It's not something, again, that we have to work for. And then we finally automatically encode things for frequency. This is for how often things happen. So how many times did you see your friend in the hallway? How many times did you, lose your phone? How many times did you go to the bathroom during school? These, again, are things you don't have to do anything to get into your long-term memory. It would be so wonderful in life if everything we learned automatically encoded, but unfortunately that's not how it works, and that's why there is also effortful encoding. And effortful encoding is the work. This is the effort, the energy, the work that we need to put into getting information from the outside world into our long-term memory. It takes effortful encoding to learn all the different concepts and theories that we're learning in psychology, to learn all the principles in math class, to learn how to memorize all the students' names in your classroom. Those all take effort. They take work. And so there's kind of three different levels of effortful processing, all the way from shallow to intermediate to deep processing. So the lowest level of effortful processing is shallow. This is also called structural encoding. This is really encoding at a very elementary, basic level. This is where we might encode structures of words or the physical characteristics of words. We might have an example of shallow processing is the word written in capital letters. So this is where we are just trying to encode things at a very basic, low level. The second level of effortful processing is called intermediate or phonemic encoding. And this is where we might emphasize on what words sound like. What does a word rhyme with? This is better than shallow, but still not going to get you very strong long-term recollection of information. The very best form of effortful encoding is deep processing, or what we call semantic processing. And in this type of encoding, we are semantically encoding. We are encoding information for what it means. So we are encoding words for what is the meaning of those words? Why do those words matter in the bigger context of what I'm trying to memorize? And we found that the deeper and more meaningful we can make connections, the retention is going to be so much better. If we can make content meaningful, we are deeply processing that content. We're going to memorize that a lot longer. So for example, take a look at the very bottom paragraph down there, and I'll give you a second to pause and read that paragraph. If we were going to shallow process that paragraph, we are going to just kind of process, are the words in capital letter? What is the order of those words? The structure of those words? You're not going to memorize very much of that. If I move to intermediate, I try and look at like, what do some of those words rhyme with? What do those words sound like? Maybe I'm going to just repeat those words. That's that intermediate level. If, however, I was going to try and deeply or semantically encode that, I would need to know, what is that paragraph about? What is the meaning of all of those words together in that paragraph? Because without knowing what those words mean in the context of what that paragraph is about, I can't possibly process that information for long-term retention. So if I were to tell you that that paragraph is all about laundry and how you do laundry, you all of a sudden have meaning to what those words are about. And knowing the meaning or the context is going to help you memorize that paragraph much better, because all of a sudden you have a purpose, you have a meaning, you have an understanding as to what does this have to do with anything. And so the more we can deep process, give meaning to what we're learning, ideally connect it to our personal lives, somehow find out why this content is important, where does this content relate in the bigger scheme of a unit or a course, the more we can give meaning, the better off we're going to be at encoding that information. So kind of those 3 levels of effortful encoding, our goal is always to get to that deep processing. How can we give meaning, give personal connection to all the things that we're learning? And once we can do that, our memory is going to skyrocket. So we are going to focus for the next few slides on what are some strategies to better effortfully encode information. What are the different things that we could do or that we already do that's going to make encoding more likely to happen? So we are going to look at different effortful processing strategies such as rehearsal, chunking, mnemonics, hierarchies, the spacing effect, and the testing effect as all ways in which we can effortfully encode. So the very first effortful encoding strategy is rehearsal. I'm sure you've heard of this. This is probably your number one strategy that you use when you are studying. Rehearsal involves kind of a mental repetition of information. And for example, like if I'm trying to memorize Spanish vocabulary terms, the repetition of the vocab term and what it is in Spanish over and over, that's rehearsal. Breaking down rehearsal even further, there's kind of 2 different types of rehearsal or of mental repetition. One of those is is called maintenance. This is repeating information over and over, but you're not connecting to the meaning of the content. You're just trying to memorize information. So I'm just memorizing this term means this. This term is this. I'm not really trying to understand with what that means in larger terms. So I might just memorize every single periodic, every single one of the things on the periodic table chart versus trying to figure out the meaning of what all those periodics mean in relation to each other or in relation to a lab in class. So maintenance is literally just repeating information over and over and over and over again. Elaborative rehearsal is a little bit more successful, a little bit more helpful. And this is where we connect information that we're trying to learn to something we've already learned or already have stored in our long-term memory. Think about that semantic encoding. We give it meaning. I always talk in class about making hooks or linking information that we learn to something else that we already know to give our brain an easier pathway to find that content. That's what we mean by elaborative rehearsal. We are trying to connect maybe that Spanish vocabulary term to some sort of visual experience that we might have had in the past. Or we are relating those parts of the periodic table. We are relating those parts of the periodic table to a lab that we did in class and helping to give connections between something we've already learned and giving that content meaning rather than just rote memorization. A second technique to effortful encoding is called chunking. And this is when we take larger amounts of information and we put it into smaller segments or groups. So a very simple example is rather than trying to memorize, 12 different numbers, instead I could chunk those numbers into 3 groups of 4. And now all of a sudden I'm memorizing 3 groups of 4 rather than 12 individual numbers. If I can chunk that information into smaller segments, it makes it easier to remember that information. So this is a lot of times also something that I tell you to do in your notes. Put like information together. Put it into a chunk, into a box, into a group. So rather than memorizing 8 different vocab terms, you can memorize 2 chunks of information that go together. Anytime we can put larger amounts of information into smaller segments, the better off we're going to be for memorizing that information. So, for example, we learned about the brain, right? Breaking it down into like the lobes of the brain, tools of studying the brain, the limbic system, the brainstem. When we are chunking, rather than looking at 30 different parts of the brain, we broke it into 4 different chunks of the brain. It's going to be so much easier to memorize that because we are just giving ourselves less information essentially to memorize. The next effortful encoding strategy is using what we call a mnemonic device. Mnemonic devices are memory aids that typically use visual imagery or organizational devices in order to help us better remember information. One specific type of mnemonic device is called the peg word strategy. And this uses our visual imagery skills, which we know are helpful to us, in order to memorize a list. So what it causes us to do is the first thing we have to do is we have to memorize these things. 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, 5 is a hive, 6 is pile of sticks, 7 is heaven, 8 is gate, 9 is a line, 10 is a hen. Then we take any sort of list and we relate that list to those pictorial representations. So let's say I'm trying to memorize a list of groceries I need to get without writing it down. So the first item on that list is carrots. I might visualize a bun with a bunch of carrot sticks sticking out of it, right? And the second item I need to get is, let's say, a loaf of bread. I might imagine a shoe smashing a loaf of bread. So I'm going to visualize the list in comparison to the items 1 through 10 that I've already memorized. So when I get to the store and I say, okay, 1 is a bun. Oh, yeah, that's right. The carrot sticks. I can visualize the carrot sticks sticking out of the bun, and I remember to get carrot sticks. And then I say 2 is a shoe. Oh, that's right. The shoe was banging on that loaf of bread. I need to get the loaf of bread. So this is good for memorizing lists when we don't have a way to write that information down. The second mnemonic device is called the method of Loci, which is also called the memory palace, is another way that they've called it before. This is where we will visualize a familiar location and we will associate that location with the items we need to remember. So a lot of memory champions use this technique. So you already have automatically encoded where everything is in your house, right? That's something you didn't have to work for. So if you can then attach things you're trying to memorize to locations in your house, then all you need to do is walk through your house to help remember that information. So, for example, one of like the memory competitions that people use this strategy for is memorizing a pack of 52 cards. And the record for this is memorizing 52 cards in 2 minutes, in under 2 minutes. And so this is done by simply walking through your house and visualizing each of those cards in different areas of your house. So then when it goes to repeating that, all you have to do is go back to that visual spot, go to where you started, and walk through your house to remember each of those cards and get that in a lot shorter of time than you're going to find by just trying to repeat those, because you are attaching it to something else, right? You are giving it meaning rather than it just trying to root memorize that card. You are connecting it to something that you already have in your long-term memory. You're doing that elaborative rehearsal by connecting it to something you already have in your long-term memory, i.e., the structure of your house. The third effortful encoding strategy is called hierarchies. This is very similar to chunking, but this is where we put information into broad categories and then we divide and subdivide it into smaller ones. So it helps us not only to visually see this information, but it also helps us to subdivide it into smaller chunks. So rather than trying to learn every single cat, every single dog, and every single unicorn on this list, right? One way I might have it, which a lot of you have in your notes, you just have a long list that says cat, Siamese, Persian, blah, 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 poodle, French bulldog. You just have a long list and their definitions next to them. If you can take that content and put it in this hierarchy, all of a sudden now you've broken down pets into 3 categories: cats, dogs, unicorns. You now have 3 chunks, and you are harnessing that visual ability that you have where we are subdividing in those lines and those hierarchies. So you can not only remember, oh, I remember Siamese, that was over to the left where cats were. Or I remember Labrador, oh, that was in the bottom middle where dogs were. So now we're not only using our visual automatic encoding. Remember, we automatically encode things for space where they're located. We've also used chunking, where we've broken it into smaller pieces of information, all of which is going to help us remember that information much longer. So in your notes, this is why I encourage you, put things in boxes, make things connect, make things into hierarchies, break it down to like items together. The next effortful encoding strategy is called the spacing effect. So first we want to look up here at this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This is what we know about information we learn. We know that when we learn new information, right immediately when we've learned it, we have 100% retention. 20 minutes later, look at how much less we have retained. Again, look at an hour later, how much less we've retained. 9 hours, 1 day, 2 days. We kind of start after that day to kind of level out. But that immediate forgetting curve, that immediate information, that immediate cutoff is really quite intense. What we found is that if we can use a technique called spacing effect, where we distribute our practice rather than try and do massed practice where we cram that information in all at one time, if we do that distributed practice, look at the bottom left, right? Here was our projection. And then here, first time we review, much less. Second time we review, much less. Third time we review, much less. Fourth time we review, much less. If we can distribute our practice and go back to that information multiple times, we can lessen that forgetting curve dramatically and increase our long-term retention of information. So studying for 10 minutes a day over 7 days is much, much better for our long-term retention than studying for 70 minutes in 1 day. And the final effortful strategy is called the testing effect. And the testing effect is exactly what it sounds, taking a test. When you get new information, when you learn new information, rather than going back and trying to relearn it over and over again, self-test, self-check, take a multiple choice test, get that blank study guide and see what you can fill out. Highlighting and rereading the text, that's not nearly as effective as taking a daily quiz or answering questions or relating that content to teach somebody else that material. Anytime you can test your knowledge, you can have somebody ask you questions. You can use flashcards with questions on them. You can get out that blank study guide. The more you are testing your knowledge versus just reviewing your knowledge, the better off your long-term recall is. And so you can see 2 different examples down here. One is trying to remember pictures. If you did not at all, you just learned that information, here's where you're at. If you do a test where you learn the information and then you take a test on it, and then we check your recall, it's a little bit higher. If you, again, learn that information and you take 3 different tests, 3 different practice tests, and then I check your information, look at how much stronger you are when you get tested. You can also look at here, the memory retention with or without the testing effect. So over time, right? If you're without the testing effect, right, you're just reviewing information, that memory retention is much less than if you learn that information and you test yourself and test yourself and test yourself. The retention of that information is going to be much, much, much higher. Finally, my last thing for today is what biologically is happening when we are using these encoding strategies. And so we look at something called long-term potentiation. And every time we are rehearsing, we're using a mnemonic device, we are effortfully encoding, we are doing the testing effect. Every single time we're doing that, what we are doing is we are biologically strengthening our neural connections. This is called long-term potentiation. And this is kind of like taking a magic marker, and every time you study something, you draw a magic marker line, and you study that again, and you draw another magic marker line over the same line. And the more you practice, the thicker and stronger those synaptic connections get. That is what's happening to your neurons in your brain when you are practicing, when you are rehearsing, when you are using mnemonic devices. You can see not only are there more neurotransmitters, but there also is larger, more receptor sites to better get that information. So biologically in our brain, we are seeing the strengthening of those neurons firing together in order to, again, strengthen how long we have that information in memory. That is it for our video lecture today. Thanks so much for listening.